Settle in and let yourself grow heavy. There's nowhere to be now, nothing to do but rest. Quietly, we'll drift into the old Norse tale of Fenrir, the wolf the gods feared. When this helps you sleep, subscribe. I add a new one every single night. In the east of Jotunheim, there is a forest where the trees grow so close together that the sky between their crowns is reduced to thin lines of pale gray, and the light, when it comes at all, arrives sideways and dim, as though it has spent itself getting through. The Norse sources call this place Jarnvid, the ironwood. The trees there have trunks the color of old iron, not brown or red, the way bark tends to be in softer climates, but the specific dark gray of metal left out in weather for a long time. The branches above are not loud. The wind, if it moves through at all, moves slowly, and the sound it makes is low and continuous, less like wind and more like breathing, the particular patient sound of something large that is simply present, without intent, without urgency, simply there. The outside world does not reach this place easily. Whatever sounds come from beyond the tree line are absorbed before they arrive at any center. In the ironwood, there is no center to arrive at. There is only more forest, stretching on in the way that Jotunheim stretches on, without convenient edges, without the kind of borders that the gods of Asgard favor. The gods who build walls and name halls, and prefer to know precisely where one thing ends and another begins. A giantess moves through this forest. Her name is Angrboda, and the name carries its meaning plainly in Old Norse, without requiring interpretation. She who bodes anguish, the one who brings grief. It is not a name given after the fact, not a name assigned in retrospect, once what she set in motion had become clear to the watching world. In the mythological sources, it is simply the name she has, the way the forest has its color, and the wind has its particular sound. She belongs to the Jotnar, the giants of Norse cosmology, beings who predate many of the gods, and whose relationship to the Aesir is structured less by enmity than by a complex and ongoing tension, a mutual awareness of power, meeting power across the boundary of different natures. Angrboda is not peripheral in Norse cosmological terms. She is a figure of the East, of the ironwood, of the place where the forces that exist outside Asgard's careful order maintain their own condition and their own time. The Prose Edda, composed by the Icelandic scholar and chieftain Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century, is the primary source that preserves what is known of Angrboda in formal narrative. Snorri gathered the mythological traditions of the Norse world at a time when they were aging, when Christianity had been established in Iceland for 2 centuries, and the old cosmological framework was receding from active belief into memory and literary record. He was a careful and prolific writer, and what he produced is neither simply a transcription of older oral tradition, nor a purely original composition, but something in between, a text that preserves the structure and content of myths that had existed long before his time, while inevitably shaping them through the act of writing them down. The Prose Edda's section, known as Gylfaginning, the beguiling of Gylfi, is organized as a dialogue in which a king of Sweden named Gylfi travels to Asgard in disguise and poses questions to 3 figures who are themselves the Aesir in disguise. Through their answers, Snorri provides a systematic account of Norse cosmology, the gods, the world structure, its beginning, and its end. Angrboda appears within this account as the giantess of the ironwood, the mother of 3 children, whose existence the gods eventually had to consider carefully and as a collective matter. It is worth pausing on what the ironwood itself represents in the Norse cosmological landscape, because the place is not merely a setting, but a location with its own significance within the broader structure of the 9 realms. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, is generally understood in the sources to exist at the margins of the inhabited world, far from the center that the gods occupy in Asgard, far from the middle realm of humans called Midgard. But Jarnvitr is specifically the eastern portion of that already marginal territory, the place within the wilderness that is furthest from the divine order. Kar the Jotnar who live there are not simply different from the gods, but exist in a relationship with the world's edges that the gods do not fully see or oversee. The ironwood in the sources is described as a place where wolves are bred, not domestic wolves, not Odin's wolves, who lie at his feet in Valhalla, known and named and wholly belonging to their keeper, but a different kind, larger and stranger, associated with the sky and with fate. The she-wolves of the ironwood are described in the Poetic Edda as being ancestral to the wolves that chase the sun and moon across the sky. A forest that breeds the predators of celestial bodies is not a peripheral detail. It is a location where the forces that will eventually shake the frame of the world are quietly and continuously produced. Loki's relationship to this place and this giantess is what the sources record without extensive commentary. Snorri describes Loki as counted formally among the Seer, present in Asgard, associated with the gods, occupying a place in the divine world's social order, despite being born of Jotun blood on both sides. His father was Farbauti, and his mother was Laufey, both Jotunar. In ordinary times, the sources suggest, this was not a matter of active concern or remark. Loki moved among the gods as one of them, was involved in their affairs, assisted them, complicated them, was as present in their councils and adventures as any Aesir-born deity. The mythology does not present his dual identity as a visible mark he carried or as something that placed him under constant suspicion. He belonged to both categories and was fully contained by neither, and in ordinary times the seam between those categories was not a place of active tension. He was simply Loki, quick, useful, difficult, present. But in Jotunheim, in the Ironwood, away from Asgard and the Aesir's oversight, Loki and Angrboda conceived 3 children. The sources do not specify the timing with precision or describe the circumstances in detail. What the Prose Edda records is the fact of the union and the fact of its results. 3 beings brought into existence at the intersection of Loki's dual bloodline and Angrboda's Jotun nature, each of them something other than what either of their parents was, each of them carrying in their form a different answer to the question of what exists at the edge of things. The first was Fenrir, a wolf. The second was Jormungandr, a serpent. The third was Hel, a being who would rule over the realm of the dead, whose nature the sources describe as divided, one half of her body living and one half belonging to the dead. 3 children, each one occupying a different domain at the edge of the world's order. 3 children who would each, in their own domain, eventually stand in direct opposition to one of the major Aesir powers, Fenrir against Odin, Jormungandr against Thor, Hel against whatever force maintained the boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it. The Norse cosmological tradition does not treat these births as aberrations. This is important to understand about how the mythological sources frame what Angrboda produced in the Ironwood. Within the structure of Norse cosmological thought, a monstrous birth at the intersection of divine and Jotun bloodlines is not an unexpected deviation, not a malfunction in the world's order. It is a fate-laden event, something that the structure of the cosmos already accounted for, already held a place for, in the same way that Yggdrasil, the great world tree, holds within its branches and roots all 9 realms simultaneously, encompassing both the orderly world of Asgard and the wilder territories beyond. The Norse world, as the sources describe it, is not a world in which existence is divided cleanly into good and catastrophic, into ordered and disordered, into what belongs and what should not be. It is a world in which the forces of order and the forces that will eventually unmake that order are both present from the beginning, held in tension across the span of the current age, with the conclusion already encoded in the prophecies the gods themselves have access to. Monstrous births, in this framework, are not surprises. They are events whose significance unfolds across cosmic time rather than within the span of ordinary lives. Yggdrasil itself is the structure within which this understanding is made concrete. The world tree extends through 9 realms in Norse cosmological geography, an ash tree of such scale that the sources treat it less as a tree in any familiar sense, and more as the organizing principle of the cosmos. Its roots reach in 3 directions, into the well of Erd, where the Norns sit and weave fate, into the spring of Mimir, whose waters hold wisdom that Odin paid an eye to drink, and into Niflheim, the realm of mist and cold, where the dead who did not die in battle eventually go. Its branches hold Asgard aloft. Its trunk passes through the middle realms. Every realm, every kind of being, every cosmological force has a location on or within this structure. The Norns, who determine the fates of gods and humans alike, tend the tree at its root. Eagles and serpents move through it in a continuous pattern that the sources describe as old and unchanging. The world tree is a system in which even what seems to exist at the furthest margin has its assigned position. What is born in the ironwood is not outside this system. It is part of it, already placed, already written into the structure that the Norns have been tending since before the gods made the inhabited world from the body of the slain giant Ymir. The births at the intersection of Loki and Angrboda were not interruptions to the pattern. The sources hold them as part of the pattern's shape. When the Aesir became aware of these children, when, as Snorri records in Galfaginning, word reached Asgard of what had been produced in Jotunheim, the gods did not simply leave them where they were. Prophecy was involved. The Norse sources describe the Aesir as having access to the knowledge of what would come, either through Odin's sustained practice of gathering wisdom at great personal cost, or through the utterances of seeresses whose vision extended across the full span of cosmic time, from the world's making to its eventual unmaking. What the prophecies said about Angrboda's children was not ambiguous. Great harm would come from them. Each of them would play a role in the events the tradition calls Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, the end of the current age. And so the Aesir brought them to Asgard, not to welcome them, but to assess them, to consider what was to be done, to look at what the ironwood had produced, and make determinations about how each should be managed for the duration of the age. It is a pragmatic response, characteristically divine in the way the Norse sources describe divine behavior, not naive, not cruel, but operating with full awareness of the situation's shape, while still making decisions that the tradition records as consequential and morally complex. Hel was sent to Niflheim to rule over the dead, those who died of illness or old age, rather than in battle. Jormungandr was thrown into the ocean, encircling Midgard, where he grew until he was large enough to encircle the inhabited world and bite his own tail. Fenrir remained in Asgard. Each assignment was its own kind of containment, each one a decision about how to manage a known and documented threat for as long as the current age would hold. The Aesir in the Norse sources are not beings who are surprised by fate. They are beings who know what is coming and act within that knowledge, which gives their decisions a quality that is distinct from what a tradition with surprise built into its cosmology would produce. They are deliberate. They are often brave. And they are, in the way the sources make clear through the structure of the myths themselves, ultimately unable to prevent what the Norns have already written into the roots of the world tree. The Poetic Edda stands alongside Snorri's Prose Edda as the other major source for Norse mythology, and its relationship to Snorri's work is significant. The Poetic Edda is a collection of Old Norse poems gathered in the Codex Regius, a manuscript written in Iceland and dated by scholars to approximately 1270 CE. The poems it contains are considerably older than the manuscript itself. They draw on oral tradition that predates the writing down of Norse mythology by centuries, and some scholars have argued that individual poems in the collection may preserve material from as early as the Viking Age, the period between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries. The Codex Regius is a small book, a vellum manuscript written in a careful hand on calfskin, its pages dense with verse, its letters pressed close together in the way that Icelandic manuscript culture favored, each line of poetry given its full weight in the narrow columns of the page. It was rediscovered in the 17th century, having passed out of scholarly awareness for several hundred years, and is now held in Reykjavik. Its physical existence is the kind of particular, humble, extraordinary fact that the study of old traditions tends to produce. A small book, held together carefully, preserving within it a vision of the cosmos that was already ancient when the scribes set it down. Among the poems the Codex Regius holds is the Voluspa, the seeress's prophecy, and it is this poem that most fully establishes the Norse tradition's relationship to the events the current age is moving toward. The Voluspa is structured as an account given by a Volva, a seeress, summoned by Odin to describe what she has seen across the full span of cosmic time. She begins with the world's making. She moves through the lives of the gods. She arrives at the events of Ragnarok, the signs, the battles, the deaths, and she describes them with the specific authority of one who has seen rather than one who predicts. The poem does not announce its content as future possibility. It presents what the seeress knows as a complete picture, as though the events of the world's end have already occurred in whatever mode of time the seeress inhabits, and are being reported back to Odin with the calm specificity of an eyewitness account. Fenrir appears in the Voluspa without a genealogical introduction. His name arrives in the poem's verses as a known quantity, a recognized figure, a presence the poem's intended audience would have understood without requiring any explanation of who he was or where he came from. This is itself a form of information about how the Norse tradition held him. He was not an obscure figure requiring context. He was a figure whose presence at the edge of the world's history was so well established in Norse cosmological understanding that the seeress's poem could invoke him and be understood immediately. The Voluspa references the great wolf in its account of the signs that will precede Ragnarok, a wolf breaking free, a serpent rising from the sea, the sky splitting, the old order undone, and in each reference, the figure is invoked as someone the audience already knows, already places, already understands in relation to the larger shape of what is described. The poem does not need to establish Fenrir. He is already there, already known, already part of the structure that everyone present was already carrying. This quality of a myth that existed long before any particular telling of it is one of the things that the Poetic Edda's manuscript tradition makes visible in a specific and quiet way. The Voluspa's verses in the Codex Regius were copied by a scribe who was working in a Christian Iceland, setting down in writing a cosmological vision whose active religious life was already centuries in the past. The poem was preserved not as a living sacred text, but as something the culture recognized as worth keeping, as literature, as history, as the record of what had once been believed and how it had been believed. The scribe's hand moving across calf skin in the 1270s was carrying something that had traveled from the Viking Age through generations of oral transmission to arrive at that moment of writing, and the act of writing it was both a preservation and a transformation. Once it was written, it was no longer purely oral, but it was also no longer purely at risk of being lost. The manuscript is a particular kind of witness, not to the events it describes, but to the fact that for many centuries before that calfskin page was made, these stories and these figures were alive in the minds and mouths of a people who found in them a sufficient and complete account of how the world was structured, what forces held it in shape, and what would eventually undo it. The specific presence of the ironwood in the Poetic Edda, its trees and its wolves, its position in the east of Jotunheim, its role as the place where what chases the sun is bred. These details are present in the tradition, not as decoration, but as cosmological geography. The 9 realms of Norse cosmological understanding are distributed through Yggdrasil's structure in a specific and organized way, and the ironwood's position in Jotunheim gives it its character within that organization. What is made there is made at a remove from Asgard's supervision and Asgard's order. What grows there has the quality of things that have not been accounted for by the gods' careful management of the world's shape, because they have not grown within reach of that management. Angrboda's children, conceived and carried and born in the ironwood, carry the quality of the place. They are not simply dangerous beings who happen to be produced by a dangerous union. They are the kinds of beings that the ironwood produces, beings whose nature is oriented toward the edges of things, toward the forces that operate at the boundaries of the current age, toward what will eventually be let loose when the age ends. To approach Fenrir's origins with the kind of interest they deserve is to approach them with patience, with the willingness to sit for a time in the ironwood before anything has happened there, before the children have been brought to Asgard, before the gods have made their assessments and their assignments. It is to notice the quality of the air in that iron dark forest, the particular sound of its wind, the way the light fails to penetrate cleanly. It is to hold Angrboda as a figure with her own place in the mythological world before she is simply the mother of consequential children, to let her name carry its full weight, she who bodes anguish, the one who brings grief, without rushing that weight toward its narrative fulfillment. It is to notice that Loki's presence in 2 worlds simultaneously, counted among the Aesiri while carrying Jotun blood on both sides, is not a flaw in the mythology's accounting, but a feature of it, a careful construction that allowed the mythological tradition to explore what happens at the boundary between categories. And it is to let the world tree hold all of this at once, the orderly halls of Asgard above, the well of fate at the root, and somewhere in the eastern margins of Jotunheim, in a forest of iron-gray trees, the quiet fact of something being made that the world was already shaped to receive. The relationship between the oral tradition that produced these myths and the manuscripts that eventually preserved them is not simple. What Snorri recorded in the early 13th century was shaped by his position in time and by his purposes as a writer, which included preserving the poetic vocabulary of the Old Norse world as a reference for the Icelandic skaldic tradition he valued. The Prose Edda is not a neutral archive. Snorri interprets, organizes, and frames the myths within a dialogue structure that has its own literary logic, and the Christian intellectual context of his time inevitably inflected what he chose to include and how he chose to frame it. Similarly, the scribes who copied the poems of the Codex Regius were working within their own context, making decisions about what to include and in what order, and the manuscript they produced reflects those decisions. The tradition that lies behind both texts is something neither of them fully contains. It was wider, older, more varied across regions and time periods than any single text can represent. The Voluspa in the Codex Regius is not the only version of the seeress's prophecy that existed. Another version survives in a different manuscript, with variations that scholars have spent considerable energy mapping. What is preserved incompletely, through the accidents of what was written, what was copied, what survived fire, and damp and the general attrition of centuries. The tradition as it now exists is the tradition's remainder, not its totality. This is worth holding because it changes how the figures in the tradition are understood. Fenrir, as a figure within Norse cosmological tradition, was not a character in a single fixed story. He was a presence in a widely shared cosmological framework, invoked in many different contexts, known through many different channels, verse and tale, and the visual culture of runestones and carvings, some of which survive in Scandinavia and depict scenes from the mythological tradition in forms that are sometimes recognizable and sometimes debated. The seeress in the Voluspa did not need to introduce him to her audience, because her audience knew him already through all of those channels, had grown up with the shape of the Norse cosmos as a framework they inhabited rather than a text they studied. When the poem speaks of the great wolf, the audience knew which wolf, what it meant, where it stood in the structure of things. The poem was not informing them, it was invoking, in the specific register of skaldic verse, something they already carried. The Codex Regius lies somewhere now in a climate-controlled archive in Reykjavik, its calfskin pages held carefully in conditions designed to preserve them for as long as preservation is possible. It is a small manuscript. Its pages, if they were spread open, would not fill a large table. The hand that wrote it is long gone. The scribe who copied the Voluspa in that careful, close script did not know that the manuscript would become one of the most important documents in the history of Norse mythology, did not know that it would disappear for several centuries. It would be rediscovered, would travel, would be studied by scholars across the world, who would spend careers debating the age and provenance and meaning of the verses it holds. The scribe was simply writing, setting down in dark ink on calfskin a set of verses that the tradition considered worth preserving, working carefully because careful work was the standard, moving from one verse to the next with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that what was being written was worth the attention it required. The Voluspa's account of Fenrir does not need to establish his origins because the Norse world already carried them. The poem arrives in the middle of a tradition and speaks from within it, not to it, the way one speaks within a room where everyone already understands the language, where the words do not need to be explained, but only said. The seeress's voice in that poem moves through the world's history, as though she has stood at a height from which all of it is visible simultaneously, and what she sees when she looks toward the great wolf is not a figure requiring introduction, but a presence that has been there from the beginning of the telling, waiting in the structure of things for the moment when its role in the world's shape becomes fully legible. That moment is not here yet in the tradition sequence, The ironwood still stands with its iron-gray trees and its particular silence, and Grabada still moves through it, carrying what she carries, and the scribe's hand has set down the verses carefully, in dark ink on calfskin, encoding in the close and patient letters of the manuscript, a story that the Norse world had already been telling for a very long time, a story that was old when the manuscript was made, and that the manuscript has kept quietly ever since. The Codex Regius in its archive holds many things, but what it holds in the verses of the Völuspá, in the references to the great wolf that need no explanation, is the record of a world that understood certain things about the shape of existence, that beings born at the intersection of categories are not aberrations, but features, foresaw that the forces that will eventually unmake the current order are present within it from the beginning, that the Norns weaving at the root of the world tree have already accounted for what the ironwood produces. These are not comfortable cosmological propositions exactly, but they are not despairing ones either. They are in the specific register of the Norse tradition as the sources preserve it, simply true, the shape of the world as the tradition understood it, for hold patiently in a small manuscript on calfskin, in a hand that knew the letters, and set them down one after another, encoding a very old and very large story in the dark ink of a careful and ordinary afternoon. Fenrir arrived in Asgard as a small thing. That is worth holding for a moment before the story moves to what he became. At the beginning, he was a wolf pup, young enough to be carried, young enough to be assessed, young enough that the gods could look at him and still believe they were making a decision rather than inheriting one. The Prose Edda records the fact plainly. Loki's 3 children were brought to Asgard, and among them was a wolf. At that moment, the wolf was not large. He was not yet the figure that would come to matter so deeply to Norse cosmological thought. He was a young animal set down somewhere in the realm of the gods, and the gods gathered around him and looked. There is something particular about that initial image, the smallness of it, the way it sits at odds with everything that follows. Asgard was a realm built for beings of considerable scale. Its halls were long, its gods were old and powerful, shaped by their offices and their histories, and the considerable weight of their divine functions. And into this realm was brought a wolf pup, small enough that his arrival must have seemed, for a moment, almost manageable, almost like a problem that could still be solved cleanly, or avoided, or contained without difficulty. For slight that Ivralman, the gods had made their assessment, and brought him here rather than leaving him in Jotunheim, which meant they believed they were in control of the situation. For a little while, that belief may even have been correct. The Prose Edda's account of what followed does not specify a single day of alarm. It does not record a moment when one of the Aesir looked at Fenrir and said that this was the day things had become genuinely worrying. What it records instead is accumulation, day by day, in the way that things grow when they are fed and given time. Fenrir grew, not the way a mortal wolf grows, reaching its adult size in a predictable season, leveling off into the animal it would be for the rest of its life, occupying a defined and stable amount of space in the world. The growth that Gylfaginning describes has a different character entirely. It continued. The rate at which Fenrir increased in size and in what the sources call ferocity showed no sign of the plateau that would occur in any ordinary animal. There was no moment when his growth slowed toward its conclusion, and the gods could exhale and say, "There, now we know what he is, and how large he will be." Every day, he was larger than the day before. Every day, the calculation the gods had made when they brought him here became slightly less accurate. The margin between the wolf they had assessed and the wolf that was actually before them, widening in the way that small errors widen over time. Gulfaginning does include one image that functions as a retrospective measure of how far that growth eventually went. By the time of the final age, the tradition holds Fenrir's upper jaw would reach the sky and his lower jaw would scrape the earth, a wolf whose body had become a kind of cosmological architecture, his open mouth spanning the entire distance between the surface of the world and the vault of the heavens. That image is worth sitting with, not because it describes anything the gods in Asgard could see at the time, but because it tells you something about the nature of the growth they were observing. It was not biological. It was not the growth of an animal moving toward its natural adult form. It was the growth of something whose scale was indexed to the age it was heading toward, a creature that was becoming, across the long span of the current era, the size that the end of the current era required. The gods watching Fenrir increase day by day were watching, though they may not have framed it this way to themselves, the slow materialization of a cosmological event. The Norse world was not without its wolves. That is worth establishing, because Fenrir did not arrive into a tradition that had no relationship with wolves, no existing sense of what a wolf meant or what it could be. Odin himself kept two, named Geri and Freki in the Prose Edda, described as his companions in Valhalla, animals who received from the Allfather's table the meat that he himself did not eat, since Odin sustained himself on wine alone. Geri and Freki were large, still animals in the sources, comfortable in their place, belonging fully to their keeper, their presence one of the expected features of Valhalla, rather than a source of unease. They were the Allfather's wolves, and that phrase carries a kind of settled weight. They were his, they were defined by their relationship to him, and that definition contained them comfortably within the known structure of things. In the Berserker tradition, the wolf appeared again as a source of battle power, the warrior who took on wolf qualities in combat, who moved and fought with a ferocity understood to come from that specific animal's particular way of being in the world. The Prose Edda documents the berserkers among the traditions associated with warriors devoted to Odin, and the wolf they drew on was a wolf whose power was purposeful, channeled, serving the ends of battle in a human context. This was a wolf made useful, a wolf whose qualities had been extracted and redirected into the shape of a man fighting in the Allfather's service. Then there were Skoll and Hati, two wolves who appear in the Prose Edda as present tense facts about the structure of the Norse sky, engaged in a perpetual pursuit. Skor chases the sun, Hati chases the moon. They have been doing this for the entire span of the current age, moving in a continuous circuit across the vault of the heavens, always in motion, never catching what they pursue. They're running a permanent feature of the sky above the inhabited world. Snorri records this not as history, but as ongoing description. This is what is happening above you, right now, in the world as it currently exists. Two wolves in motion, the sun and moon in motion ahead of them, the chase going on without interruption. There is something both restless and oddly regular about that image, a relentless pursuit that is also, because it never resolves, a kind of sustained order. The wolves run, the sun and moon stay ahead, the sky holds its shape because the chase is never completed. Fenrir, then, arrived into a world that already knew what wolves were and had assigned them specific places within its structure. Odin's wolves, contained, belonging. The Berserker's wolf, purposeful, human-channeled. Skoll and Hati, perpetual, structural, part of the sky's ongoing movement. Each of these was a wolf held within a legible relationship to the Norse cosmological order. Each one could be pointed to and explained, its function and its place understood. Fenrir was the wolf who would not fit into any of those categories. Not contained, not purposeful, not performing a defined function in the sky's architecture, simply growing in Asgard beyond every category the gods had available. The decision to keep Fenrir in Asgard rather than drive him away was not sentimental. The sources are clear on that point. What Gylfaginning records is a pragmatic calculation. A known threat under the gods' observation was judged preferable to an unknown threat, growing unchecked in Jotunheim, beyond their sight and beyond their ability to measure or respond to. This was not warmth. It was not acceptance. It was the particular kind of watchfulness that keeps a dangerous thing close rather than distant, on the understanding that what can be seen can perhaps be managed. The gods chose surveillance over exile because they believed or hoped that surveillance was the stronger position. The difficulty with that calculation was that surveillance is only useful when the thing being observed is not growing faster than the capacity to respond to it. Every day that Fenrir increased in size was a day that moved the gods' ability to act slightly further behind the reality of what they were dealing with. The wolf they could see was always slightly more than the wolf they had planned for. The decision made when he was a pup that keeping him close was the manageable option became, as the weeks and months continued, a decision made about a different wolf, in different circumstances, with a different set of available responses. The gods watched, Fenrir grew, and the distance between those two activities quietly widened. There is a particular quality to the image of the assembled Aesir observing Fenrir at intervals, noting his size against whatever measure they had established, speaking among themselves about what they were seeing. It is not a dramatic image. There is no single confrontation in it, no moment of crisis that crystallizes everything that came before and everything that follows into a single point of clarity. It is instead a repeated accumulating observation, the same gods, the same wolf, returning to the same assessment in the knowledge that the assessment would have changed since they last made it. The specific discomfort the Prose Edda describes is not the discomfort of fear, exactly. It is the discomfort of watching something that does not stop, in a realm built for beings whose scale is settled and known. Asgard was a place of defined things. Its halls had walls. Its gods had names and offices and relationships that had been established across a very long time. Fenrir was a thing in that realm that was refusing to be defined, growing past every boundary the gods' assessment tried to draw around him. Among all of this, the collective unease, the accumulating observation, the daily recalibration of what the wolf now was, compared to what he had been, one figure stands apart. Gylfaginning is specific on this point, and the specificity is worth noting because the text has no obligation to be specific here. The source could simply have said that the gods fed the wolf and kept him under watch. Instead, it names one god and one practice. Among all the Aesir, only Tyr had the courage to approach Fenrir daily to feed him. The god of law and justice, whose domain was oaths and the proper ordering of things. The one among the Aesir associated with the kind of courage that operates within structure rather than in opposition to it. This god walked toward Fenrir every day with food. At whatever distance the wolf now occupied from the halls of the gods, Tyr made the journey. It is worth slowing down on that detail, because the text offers it without commentary and then moves on. There are no explanations given for why Tyr specifically was the one who did this. There is no account of what it cost him to make the daily approach, no record of what the other gods said when they watched him do it, or chose not to do it themselves. Gylfa Jennings simply states the fact: only Tyr was willing, the others were not. This distinction, the singular willingness of one god, set against the collective reluctance of all the others, is presented as though it requires no explanation, as though it is sufficient simply to record that it was so. And perhaps it is sufficient. Perhaps the detail carries its own weight without commentary. Tyr was the god whose particular domain involved the maintenance of agreements between parties who did not wholly trust each other. The god called upon in the making of oaths precisely because oaths require a figure who belongs to neither side and can hold the weight of the promise between them. That Tyr should be the one to maintain a daily relationship with the wolf, that all the other gods kept their distance from, has a logic to it that is not stated in the sources, but is present in the structure of the myth. The god of the ordered contract, making a daily contract of a very particular kind, food given, proximity maintained, the relationship between wolf and god held in the simplest and most repeated of acts. The act of feeding is a small thing in itself. It happens every day among all the creatures of every world, in every tradition, without ceremony or significance. Food is given, food is received, and the day continues. But the accumulation of small acts across a long span of time produces something that is not small at all. If Tyr walked toward Fenrir every day, and the sources give no suggestion that this was occasional or intermittent, but rather a daily practice maintained throughout Fenrir's time in Asgard, then across the full span of that time, Tyr made that approach more times than the tradition thinks to count, more times than the myth stops to record individually. The approach becoming, through sheer repetition, a kind of relationship, not stated as such, not named, simply present in the daily fact of one god walking toward what all others would not walk toward, and the wolf receiving what was brought. What the wolf made of it is not recorded in the sources. The Norse tradition does not give Fenrir interiority in these early passages, does not report what he thought or felt or understood about the daily appearance of Tyr with food. The sources describe what was done, not what was experienced. But the structural fact of the relationship is there, regardless of what words the tradition uses for it. Over the long period of Fenrir's growing, the only continuous bond he had with any member of the Aesir was with the god who came every day, the god who did not observe from a distance but crossed that distance repeatedly in the specific and physical act of bringing food to a wolf that everyone else was watching from a careful remove. There is something in that which the myth holds without pressing on it too hard. The god of law and justice, approaching daily, the one figure in Asgard that the gods' collective judgment had decided was a threat. The approach itself is not a verdict. Tyr is not recorded as disagreeing with the gods' assessment of Fenrir, not documented as arguing that the wolf presented no danger, not described as naive about what Fenrir was becoming. What he is documented as doing is going, whatever his understanding of the situation, and as a god whose domain included the holding of complex arrangements between parties with conflicting interests, his understanding was presumably not simple. He continued to make the daily approach. The relationship built from that continuity is not described in the sources as a friendship or as trust, or as any named thing. It is described as a practice carried out with a regularity that the text notes as exceptional, that the other god's reluctance defines as requiring a particular quality of courage to sustain. The word courage is the one Gylfa Jennings uses, not wisdom, not affection, not duty, though any of those might apply. Courage, the specific quality associated with doing the thing one has decided to do in full awareness of what it costs. The approach to Fenrir daily was, in the assessment of the Norse sources themselves, an act that required bravery to sustain. The ordinariness of it, the food, the same journey made again, the wolf receiving what was brought, did not make it ordinary in the sense of requiring no particular strength to continue. It was ordinary in the sense of being repeated. It required courage precisely because it was repeated, because each day was a decision made again in full knowledge of what the wolf was becoming. Fenrir grew, the gods continued to observe, Terran continued to approach. The days accumulated in the way that days accumulate when they are all part of a single long situation that is not resolving, but is instead simply continuing to become what it is going to be. Asgard went about the business of Asgard, its halls maintained, its affairs conducted, its gods performing the offices they had always performed, and in some part of that realm, a wolf grew in a way that had no parallel in any creature the tradition had previously accounted for, and one god walked toward him every day with food, and the wolf received it. The Prose Edda does not editorialize on this arrangement. It does not describe Tyr's daily approach as heroic or as misguided, does not characterize the relationship it produced as beautiful or as dangerous or as anything with a single clean description. It records what happened. The god of law went to the wolf. The wolf was fed. This occurred every day throughout the period of Fenrir's time in Asgard, and the text moves past it without lingering, treating the fact as settled and moving on to what came next in the account. That briskness is, in its own way, interesting. The tradition is not trying to make a point of this. It is not presenting Tyr's daily practice as the centerpiece of some moral argument or as the setup for a lesson. It is documenting it the way it documents other elements of the mythological landscape. This is what was so. What was so? A wolf arrived in Asgard as a pup and grew past every scale the gods had available for measuring him. The gods watched with increasing unease, holding their distance, maintaining the position of observers in a situation that had been designed for observation. One god, Tyr, distinguished himself from the others by not holding his distance, by walking toward the wolf every day in an act that the sources acknowledge required courage to sustain, that was repeated so regularly it became the closest thing to an ordinary routine that existed between Fenrir and any member of the Aesir. The food given, the food received, the daily crossing of the distance between the halls of the gods, and wherever in Asgard the wolf now was. Odin's wolves lay at his feet in Valhalla in the old settled way of animals that belonged entirely to their place. Their size was known, their function was known. They were the wolves of the Allfather, and that was a legible thing within the structure of the Norse world. Somewhere else in Asgard, a different wolf, one whose size was changing faster than any observation could keep up with, whose belonging was to no category and no keeper, who was fed each day only by the one god willing to make that approach, continued to grow in the way that a cosmological event grows, slowly and without apparent limit, through the ordinary passage of days. The wolf, squirrel, and hottie moved across the sky overhead, as they had always moved, chasing the sun and moon in a pursuit that was also a kind of order. Their motion was perpetual, their function was structural. They were wolves in service of the sky's ongoing arrangement. They're running the thing that kept the sun and moon in the particular relationship to the world that the current age required. The chase that never resolves is also the chase that never disrupts. As long as they run and do not catch what they pursue, the sky holds its configuration. There is something in that, the idea that an unresolved pursuit is also a form of stability that sits in quiet proximity to what was happening in Asgard below, a wolf growing toward a size no current age could fully accommodate, a daily practice of approach maintained against the tide of that growth. The relationship between the god of law and the wolf that would not stop becoming larger than any framework the gods could build around him, kept in being, day after day, in the smallest and most repeated of acts. Tyr walked toward Fenrir. The food was given. The food was received. Whatever the nature of what that produced between them, that thing the sources do not name and do not editorialize upon, it was made each day, and each day it persisted, and each day Tor turned and made the return journey, and the distance between himself and the wolf stretched out again behind him, and tomorrow he would cross it once more. That is the image that tradition preserves from this period of the myth, not the dramatic growth, not the assembled gods and their unease, not the cosmological significance of a wolf whose scale was becoming aligned with an age's ending, though all of those things are present in the sources and are part of what this period of the story holds. The image that sits at the center of this particular passage of the myth, and that the prose Edda records with the same quiet matter-of-factness it uses for everything else, is smaller than any of that. A god walking toward a wolf, every day, with food, the approach made, the food given, the approach made again, faithfulness of the most unremarked kind, sustained across the long and uncounted repetition of ordinary days, in a realm where it was the one thing most everyone else had decided they could not do. What it cost her to continue making that approach, what it meant in terms of what the god of law understood about oaths and about the relationships they create between the parties who make them, is a question the text does not answer. It does not need to answer it here. The answer, or whatever the tradition holds that corresponds to an answer, belongs to what came later, on an island whose name the sources give, with unusual specificity, and whose geography Snorri treats as a fixed point in the mythological landscape. The island is not this section of the story. The island is what the daily approach, repeated across the full span of Fenrir's time in Asgard, was quietly moving toward. For now, the image is this, the wolf growing in the realm built for beings of settled scale, the gods watching at their careful remove, and Tor walking, again, toward what the others watched from a distance, in the particular courage of the repeated and ordinary act, the food in his hand, the distance between himself and the wolf closing with each step, and the wolf waiting, as he had waited yesterday and the day before that, for the one figure in Asgard who was willing to come. The chain ladying was a physical object before it was anything else. Iron links, each one forged to close against the next, the whole length of it, heavy enough that carrying it required effort, massive enough that when it lay on the ground it did not coil so much as pile, a thing built from the assumption that scale alone was a form of strength. This was how the Aesir first understood the problem they had set themselves. What they needed was containment, and what they knew how to make, what the Nine Worlds had always made when containment was the aim, was iron. Lading was the best version of that understanding. It was brought to Fenrir, not as a chain is brought to a prisoner, but as a challenge is brought to one whose opinion of his own strength the gods wished to test. And in this small adjustment of framing, there was a logic, the source's record, without elaborating, the suggestion that what could not be imposed might still be accepted if the asking were done correctly. Fenrir looked at Ladating. The prose Edda does not record the wolf deliberating for long. Galfa Ginning describes his assessment as essentially immediate. He saw the chain, considered it, and judged that his strength was more than equal to it. What the sources preserve in this moment is not arrogance, Exactly, but something closer to accurate self-knowledge. Fenrir was not wrong about the chain. Lighting was formidable by any standard that applied to the world the gods inhabited, any measure of material strength that the 9 realms could produce. What it was not was equal to what Fenrir had become. He accepted the challenge. He let the links be arranged around him, let the iron settle into place, and then he exerted himself against it. Gylfaginning records the action with brevity. He kicked out his legs. The chain parted. Not bent, not strained into yielding over time, but simply parted, the way a thing parts when the force applied to it is so far beyond its construction that the iron has no meaningful response to offer. Lading lay in pieces on the ground, and the Aesir stood at whatever careful distance they had maintained to watch. What the gods observed from that distance was not the failure of a plan so much as the first measurement of a problem. Lading had given them a number. It had told them, in its breaking, something precise and specific about the scale of what they were dealing with, not a range or an estimate, but a demonstrated fact. The wolf's strength exceeded what this chain could hold. The question that remained was not whether the chain had been strong enough, which was now settled, but how much stronger the next attempt would need to be. This is the register in which Gylfaginning presents the episode, not as catastrophe, but as information. The gods returned to the problem they had, and began constructing Dromi. Dromi was described as roughly twice the weight and strength of light dying. The Prose Edda's account makes clear that this was not an arbitrary multiplication, but a reasoned one. If the first chain had established a lower bound, then the second would push substantially past it, adding enough margin that even accounting for Fenrir's continued growth, the new chain should find the edge of what he could break. The gods brought it to him by the same method. Another challenge, another presentation of iron as a test rather than a sentence. And here, Gylfaginning records something that Lading's episode had not contained. Fenrir hesitated, not for long, and not in a way the sources describe as doubt, but the pause was present. He looked at Dromi and calculated. He acknowledged, in the manner of a being whose self-knowledge was genuinely precise, that this chain was heavier, that breaking it would cost more. Then he decided that the honor of demonstrating his strength against a greater obstacle was worth the additional effort, and he accepted the challenge again. Dromi's breaking was louder. Where Lotting had simply parted, Gylfaginning describes the pieces of Dromi flying outward in all directions from the single point of Fenrir's exertion, an image of dispersal, of force moving from a center in multiple directions at once, iron fragments scattered across whatever ground the testing had been arranged on. The chain had not parted so much as shattered, each fragment's trajectory carrying in miniature the measure of the force that had undone it. And from this episode Snorri records, there came a phrase that passed into ordinary Old Norse speech, to get loose from Lotting, or to dash out of Dromi, a saying used to describe accomplishing something very difficult, something requiring exceptional effort or exceptional strength. The myth had been absorbed into the language. The specific physics of Dromi's breaking, the iron going outward in all directions, had been compressed into an expression that a speaker could use without needing to know its origin, the way living speech always carries the sediment of older stories without troubling to acknowledge them. The gods stood again at their distance. Two chains lay broken in two separate places, or one was scattered and one was in pieces, and Fenrir stood in both instances unharmed, and the problem was precisely as large as it had been before, except that now they had two measurements instead of one, and a clearer sense of what the iron approach could and could not do. What it could do was provide information. What it could not do, it was now plain, was hold. The Aesir had tested the upper limit of what conventional material, made in conventional ways from conventional substance, was capable of producing. Dromi was the answer to Lotting's failure, and Dromi had also failed, and the answer to Dromi's failure was not going to come from making a third chain that was twice as heavy again. That direction had been followed to its end. What was needed was a different direction entirely. The decision that followed was one the prose Edda records as considered rather than desperate. The gods did not react to the breaking of Dromi with panic or urgency. What Gylfaginning describes is a deliberate change of approach, a recognition that the problem required thinking about differently, not simply scaled up within the same framework. If material strength was not sufficient, then what was needed was something whose strength did not derive from material in the conventional sense. If iron and scale had proved inadequate, then the answer lay in whatever the 9 worlds contained that operated by a different logic altogether. And the 9 worlds contained exactly that. In Svartalfheim, the underground realm that the Norse mythological geography associated specifically and distinctly with the most skilled makers in existence, the dwarves worked in a darkness that was also a kind of precision, producing things that the other 8 realms could not produce, and had never been built to produce. The gods sent a messenger there. Skirnir, in some accounts, made the journey down into that underground country to carry a commission, not for a chain heavier than Dromi, but for something whose strength came from a source that iron had never been asked to approach. What the dwarves made in response to that commission was Gleipnir, and Gleipnir was the absolute inversion of everything that had come before it. Where Lotting had been heavy, Gleipnir was light. Where Dromi had been so massive that its fragments flew outward when it broke, Gleipnir could be held in a single hand. It was smooth, described in the sources as resembling a silken ribbon, the kind of thing that might be used as an adornment, a decoration, something worn rather than used as restraint. There was nothing in its appearance that communicated strength. There was nothing in its weight that suggested what it was made to do. To look at it was to see a ribbon. To hold it was to hold a ribbon. The gap between what it appeared to be and what it actually was constituted the whole of its design, and that design came directly from what had gone into its making. Gylfaginning records what Gleipnir was made from, and the list is specific and strange. 6 ingredients, each one impossible or vanished, each one representing a category of thing that does not exist, or exists only in its own disappearance. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. Snorri records these as the actual material of the binding, and he adds a consequence that his account treats as direct. Because the sound of a cat's footstep was used up in Gleipnir's making, cats now walk silently. Because the beard of a woman was used up in its making, women have no beards. The 6 ingredients are presented not as metaphors or as a poetic description of craftsmanship, but as literal materials whose use in this specific making depleted their presence in the world, changed the world in small but permanent ways, altered the texture of everyday reality by removing from it something that had been there before. The dwarves of Svartalfheim had built not from abundance but from absence, had made something that held by drawing on the strength of things that cannot be broken because they do not exist in a form that breaking can reach. This was the logic that 2 iron chains had been unable to approach, because iron's logic was entirely different. Iron's strength was the strength of presence, of mass, of thickness, of material accumulation, the strength of having more. Gleipnir's strength was the strength of absence, of things that cannot be grasped because they cannot be found, of qualities that do not yield to force because they are not there to yield. Lighting and dromi could be broken because they were made of substance, and substance, however dense and heavy, can be overpowered by a force that is greater. Gleipnir could not be broken by force, because force had no purchase on what it was made from. To pull against Gleipnir was to pull against the silence of a cat's steps, against the non-existence of a woman's beard, against the place where a mountain's roots go when they go deep enough that nothing can reach them. Force requires something to push against. Gleipnir offered nothing of the kind. The dwarves completed their commission, and Gleipnir was brought up from Svartalfheim into the light of the upper world, a thin ribbon whose appearance continued to give nothing away. The gods examined it, presumably, and found in it what the sources describe, a thing that looked slight and was not, a thing that looked easily broken and was not breakable in the way that things are usually breakable. The question was no longer whether the binding was sufficient. What remained was the question of how to bring it to Fenrir and arrange for it to be used. 2 chains had already been presented as challenges and accepted. A third attempt would carry the accumulated meaning of the 2 that had preceded it. And Fenrir was not a figure the sources describe as unobservant. A ribbon after 2 iron chains would require more than a simple challenge to accept. The place chosen for the attempt was a small island called Lyngvi in the dark lake Emsvartnir. Snorri's Gylfaginning specifies this location with the kind of attention usually reserved for halls and rivers, and named cities, a geographic precision that treats the island as a fixed point within the mythological landscape rather than as a vague elsewhere where significant events took place. Lyngvi is named. Amsvartnir is named. The island is small. The lake is dark. These are the details the account preserves, and their specificity has the quality of a place someone was meant to be able to find, or at least to place within an understood geography, to anchor in the imagination as a real location within the world the tradition described. The journey to Lyngvi, however it was made, whatever transport carried the gods and the wolf across the dark water to the island's shore, is not described in detail by the sources. What the Prose Edda records is arrival, the island, the water around it, and the fact of the gathering that took place there. Lyngvi's shores are dark, the water surrounding it still. It sits at whatever distance from the lake's edge it has always sat at, small enough that its boundaries can be comprehended at a glance, remote from both Asgard and the inhabited world of Midgard. The choice of this location, like many choices the mythological sources record without elaborating the reasoning behind them, carries a logic that does not require explanation within the tradition's own terms. Remote, bounded by water, small, a place whose geography contained what was about to happen within clear physical limits, a place that could be left without carrying any of what had occurred there along into the wider world. It is worth sitting with the island for a moment before anything on it begins to move. Lyngvi and Lake Amsvartnir, as Snorri records it, is a specific place, and its specificity is part of what the tradition preserved. The Norse mythological geography that the Prose Edda describes, the 9 realms arranged within the structure of Yggdrasil, the world tree, each realm, named and assigned its character and its inhabitants, was not vague, it was detailed. Rivers had names, mountains had names, wells had names. The place where a god lost a hand and a wolf was bound for the span of an age had a name, and the name was Lyngvi, and the lake was Amsvartnir, and these names appear in the text in the same register as the name of Odin's Hall, or the river that runs between the living and the dead. The tradition held its geography with care. The gods arrived at Lyngvi. Fenrir arrived at Lyngvi, and Gleipnir was there, held in whatever way a silken ribbon is held. Light, smooth, giving nothing away about itself. What the Prose Edda records next is Fenrir's response to what he was being shown. The wolf looked at Gleipnir. He did not immediately refuse, but he did not immediately accept, and his hesitation has a quality the sources record with care. Fenrir identified something wrong, not from examining the ribbon's composition, not from any account of what it was made of or how it had been produced, but from the ribbon's character, from something in the quality of what it was. The sources describe the wolf recognizing the presence of guile, a magical character in the binding that his experience of 2 iron chains had not prepared him to name, but that he nonetheless perceived. He stated his position plainly. He saw no honor in breaking so slight-looking a fetter. He suspected treachery. This statement is one of the more quietly significant details in the Norse account of Fenrir's binding. The wolf was right. The fetter was treacherous. In exactly the sense he meant, it appeared to be one thing and was another, and the gods presenting it to him had no intention of releasing him if it held. Fenrir's suspicion was accurate in every particular. The myth does not give him the credit of having this acknowledged in the moment, but the account itself preserves his assessment without contradiction or dismissal. He was correct about Gleipnir. He was correct about the god's intentions. What he lacked was not perception, but options, and so, having named the situation accurately, he made the demand that Gylfagbul in Confugia's records. He would accept the challenge, he said, if one of the Aesir would place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, as a surety that this was what it appeared to be, as collateral held against the possibility that he was right about the treachery, so that if Gleipnir did hold and the gods did not release him, the bargain would not have been made without cost to those who had made it. The demand was logical in exactly the terms the gods had constructed. If they had nothing to hide, the pledge cost them nothing. If they had something to hide, the pledge was everything. The gods looked at one another on the island of Lyngvi, and the silence between them held the measure of what was being asked. Gylfaginning records this moment, the assembled Aesir, the wolf's demand, and the fact that none of them moved. Not one of the gathered gods of Asgard, in the full recorded account of this event, stepped forward. The courage required to feed Fenrir daily, to cross the distance between the hall of the gods and the wolf's place in Asgard, every day, with food in hand, that courage had belonged to one among them, and it was the same one who stepped forward now. Tyr alone raised his right hand and placed it between Fenrir's jaws. The binding proceeded. Gleipnir was arranged around Fenrir, while Tyr's right hand remained where it rested. The specific physical fact of it, present and warm inside the wolf's mouth, held there as a pledge while the ribbon was settled into place. The thin, silk-smooth length of Gleipnir was drawn around Fenrir's limbs, into position, the dwarf's work taking the form it had been made to take, and then Fenrir exerted himself against it. What happened to Gleipnir under that exertion was entirely unlike what had happened to Ladining and to Dromi, where the iron chains had parted or scattered, where metal had responded to force by failing in the way that metal fails, with fracture, with dispersal, with the particular drama of massive things breaking. Gleipnir held. More than held, it tightened. The resistance Fenrir's strength offered the ribbon did not translate into the ribbon's undoing, but into its deepening grip, as though the force applied against it fed directly back into the binding's hold, rather than working against it. Gleipnir had been made from things that cannot be reached, and force could not reach them now, any more than it had ever been able to. The wolf strained against something that had no breaking point, because it had no material in the conventional sense, and the straining only settled the binding more firmly into place. This was the moment Tyr had placed his hand inside the wolf's mouth to make possible. The binding held. The gods understood what that meant for Tyr's hand, understood it at the moment Gleipnir tightened, and Gylfaginning records that they laughed. All of them laughed, the account says, all except Tyr, who stood still and silent. The laughter was, presumably, the release of what had been held through the construction of Gleipnir, through the journey to Lyngvi, through the negotiation with the wolf, the exhalation of an effort that had worked. It was also something else, something the sources record without interpreting, laughter in the presence of a man who was about to lose his hand, the sound of collective relief at the moment that relief came, at a cost paid by one alone. Snorri records the laughter and Tyr's silence alongside each other without commentary. The juxtaposition does the work that commentary would only blunt. Fenrir understood, at the moment Gleipnir tightened and held, that the gods did not intend to release him. The pledge had been called. The hand was forfeit. He bit off Tyr's right hand at the wrist, fulfilling the terms of the arrangement in a technical sense, while enacting, within those same terms, the only response available to him. The pledge had been made, and the pledge had been redeemed. What Tyr lost he had known when he stepped forward on the island of Lyngvi, and none of the other gods moved, that he was going to lose. The sources do not record whether Tyr spoke at any point during the binding, before or after. What they record is that he alone stepped forward, that his hand remained in place while the binding was arranged, and that the hand was lost when the binding held. The sword hand was gone. In Norse warrior culture, the hand that held the sword was not simply a physical part of the body, but a component of identity in the most direct and practical sense. Without it, the specific work that defined a warrior's role and standing could not be performed. For Tyr in particular, the god associated in the Norse tradition with law and justice, with the keeping of oaths, and the order that sworn agreements made possible, the loss had a dimension beyond the physical. The hand had been offered as surety for an oath the gods had already decided not to keep. The loss of it fulfilled the terms of a bargain that was never made in good faith. What remained after the binding was complete was a god with one hand, a wolf held by a ribbon on a small island, and the wound that connected them, not resolved, not explained away, simply present, the way the consequences of irreversible acts are present. Old Norse poetry preserved this. The skaldic kenning that referred to Tyr's wrist, the leavings of the wolf, used as a name for a sword, encoded the event into the ordinary vocabulary of the warrior tradition. A kenning is a kind of compressed metaphor, a two-part construction in which the combination of its elements points toward a third thing. To call a sword the leavings of the wolf was to say, in ordinary poetic speech, that what a sword replaces is the hand the wolf took, that the sword stands in the place of what was bitten away on Lyngvi, that every sword held in a warrior's hand carries within its name a memory of the god who stood still on an island while everyone around him laughed. The loss was turned into language. Language was the form in which the tradition remembered it, not as exceptional or extraordinary, but as built into the ordinary way poetry worked, present in the name of a thing that warriors reached for every day. There is a quality particular to things that are absorbed into ordinary speech, rather than kept apart in the register of the exceptional. They persist differently. A phrase used in the composition of poetry, used to mean sword in the same moment it recalls Tyr's wrist, is not something that requires anyone to specifically remember the myth it came from. It moves through the tradition carried on the current of regular use, the way words move, gathering the residue of whatever generated them without requiring that generation to be named each time. The leavings of the wolf was a kenning a skald could use in a poem about any warrior holding any sword, and the myth was present in the phrase, without the myth needing to be present in the poem. This is one of the ways the oldest stories survive, not by being cited, but by being used, worn smooth by handling the way stones are worn, smooth by water, present in the language of people who may not know their origin. Gleipnir, meanwhile, was still the object it had been when the dwarves sent it up from Svartalfheim, a silken ribbon, smooth and light, the same in appearance as it had been before Fenrir, strained against it, and found it held. The breaking of Logic had left iron scattered across a floor. The breaking of Dromi had sent fragments in all directions, had produced noise and dispersal, and the particular physics of massive things coming apart. The holding of Gleipnir produced none of that. The ribbon was the ribbon. It had simply done what it was made to do, and what it was made to do left no mark on itself. This, too, was part of the inversion the dwarves of Svartalfheim had built. The iron chains announced themselves. Gleipnir was quiet. The island of Lingvo in Lake Emsvartnir is still there in Snorri's account, still named, still present in the Norse mythological landscape at the same coordinates it had always occupied. The dark water of Emsvartnir surrounds it. Its shores are the same dark color they were when the gods and the wolf arrived to conduct the business that Gylfaginning describes. The island is small enough to comprehend at a single glance from the water, remote enough that what occurs on it is not visible from any inhabited shore. It is in the geography of the tradition, a specific and fixed place, as real within that geography as the well of Mimir beneath Yggdrasil's roots, or the hall of the dead, where hell receives those who did not fall in battle. The three stages of the attempt to bind Fenrir form a sequence whose logic the Prose Edda makes explicit across the arc of Gylfaginning's account, from the heaviest iron the 9 worlds could produce, through the heaviest iron twice over, to something that had never been iron at all, that owed nothing to weight or mass or any of the qualities that iron's strength depended on. The sequence is not one of escalation within a single approach, but of arriving at a different approach entirely, of recognizing that the first framework had been exhausted, and that what lay outside it was not a stronger version of the same thing, but a different thing altogether. The dwarves of Svartalfheim did not make a better chain. They made something for which the word chain was not quite right, something whose making had required the use of materials that no longer existed because they had been used in making it. This is part of what the Norse mythological tradition preserved in its account of Gleipnir, the idea that the limits of one kind of making can be exceeded only by a different kind of making, that the strongest thing produced by conventional means is still conventional, still vulnerable in the way conventional things are vulnerable. What Gleipnir represented in the cosmological logic of the Prose Edda was the craft of Svartalfheim operating at its furthest reach, the dwarves working not with what they had, but with what they had used up, building strength from the structural logic of impossibility rather than from any accumulation of possible things. Lofthyrnir Dromi had been excellent. Gleipnir was something for which excellence was not quite the right category. The commission that produced it, the journey of a messenger from Asgard down into the underground realm, carrying a problem that the upper worlds had not been able to solve, belongs to a pattern the Norse tradition returned to in various forms. The recognition that certain problems required going somewhere else, asking beings who operated by different principles, bringing back something that the asking realm could not have made on its own. Svartalfheim in the Prose Edda's geography is not a place the Aesir visit casually. It is a place they go when what they can do is not sufficient, when the problem at hand requires a quality of making that only the dwarfs possess. The commission for Gleipnir was not the only such occasion, but it was among the most consequential, because what the dwarves made in response to it was not simply used but held. Used once and held across the span of an age, the ribbon settling into place around a wolf on a dark-shored island and remaining there. The 3 stages of the attempt deserve to be followed through each of their movements before the island comes fully into view. The first chain placed and broken, the second chain placed and broken with more force and greater dispersal, and then the long pause in the approach while the commission traveled to Svartalfheim, and the dwarves worked in their particular underground country, and Gleipnir came back into the light of the upper world. Each stage belongs to the sequence that produced the island scene, and the island scene belongs to the sequence that produced the kenning, and the kenning belonged to the ordinary speech of a tradition that used it without necessarily knowing its origin. The wolf and the god and the ribbon, present in the name of a sword, held in any warrior's hand on any day in the long span of Old Norse poetry. Lyngvi sits in the dark water. It is a small island. From the lake's surface, looking at it, the shores are close and dark, and the ground does not rise very far above the waterline. Whatever sound the lake makes against the shore, and dark still water makes very little sound, that is the sound of Svartnir, the sound of the place where the Norse mythological account placed this event, the sound that surrounded what happened on the island and persisted after everyone who had been there had left. The island remained. The water remained. The name of the island and the name of the lake remained inside the text that Snorri Sturluson set down in Iceland several centuries after the traditions it recorded had begun. And inside that text, they have the quality of places the reader was expected to be able to locate, fixed points in an understood geography rather than convenient fictions invented to give the story a setting. This is one of the things the prose Edda does with its mythological landscape. It names places the way a person names the landmarks of a country they have lived in, with the straightforward assumption that the names carry their own location, that to say Lyngvi and Amsvartnir is to point at something specific, something that can be found within the structure of the world the tradition describes. The binding of Fenrir did not happen in an unnamed elsewhere. It happened on Lyngvi, in the dark lake Amsvartnir, on a small island surrounded by still water, remote from Asgard and remote from the inhabited world of Midgard, in a place whose name Snorri records with the same precision he brings to the geography of Yggdrasil's roots and the rivers of the underworld. Seen from the water, the island is small. The dark-shored outline of it sits against the lake's surface. The water around it is still, not moving in any direction that can be seen from the lake, still in the particular way of very dark water in a large and enclosed lake, not moving visibly because it has too much room to move slowly, and nothing to press it into urgency. Lyngvi is in the middle of that stillness, its boundaries clear, its distance from any inhabited shore, sufficient that what took place on it took place in a kind of remove that the geography itself enforced. A small island in a dark lake, specific and named and fixed within the mythological world the prose Edda describes, and on it the 3 stages of the problem resolved into one outcome. The silk-smooth ribbon settled into place. The island afterward returned to whatever it had been before the gods arrived on its shores, and went quietly about the remaining work of its existence. Gleipnir did not look like what it was. That is the first thing to hold in mind about the moment on Lyngvi, that what was placed before Fenrir bore no resemblance to the tools of the 2 previous attempts, and that the wolf understood this immediately, before a single word was spoken or a single test proposed. The 2 chains that had come before, Lading and then Dromi, had at least been honest in their intentions. They had been iron, they had been heavy, They had arrived with the mass and the weight of things built to restrain, and Fenrir had met them with the same uncomplicated confidence, had strained against them and felt them part, had stood in the wreckage of each one with the straightforward satisfaction of a being who has been tested and found the test wanting. Those chains had made a claim about what they were. Their claim had been wrong, but they had made it plainly. Gleipnir made no such claim. It lay in the hand of the god who carried it to Lyngvi, like a length of silk ribbon, thin enough to see through if held up to the light, smooth along its entire surface, carrying none of the cold or the weight that iron carries. It could have been a decorative thing. It could have been something worn at a celebration in one of Asgard's great halls, something tied and knotted for ornament, rather than for any serious purpose. Nothing in its appearance indicated what it had been made from, or what it had cost the world to make it, or what it would take to break it, or that it could not, in fact, be broken at all. And Fenrir looked at it, and knew, not from the ribbon's appearance, not from its color or its texture, or the way it moved in the air. The wolf's reading of Gleipnir came from somewhere else, from the specific quality of the thing, its character rather than its form, from the way it did not quite occupy the world, the way that ordinary objects occupy the world. The dwarves of Svartalfheim had built it from absence rather than from material, from the sound that a cat's paw makes when it moves in silence, from the beard that no woman has ever grown, from the roots that no one has ever found beneath a mountain, from sinews that cannot be taken from a bear because a bear carries none, from the breath that no fish exhales into air, from the spittle that no bird produces. 6 things that do not exist, woven into something that does, and the result was a ribbon that sat slightly wrongly in the world, that had a character that no honest examination of its surface could account for, something that should not have been there, in the strict logical sense of that phrase, something made from the gaps in reality rather than from its substance. The wolf saw this. The gods had brought Gleipnir to Lyngvi with a particular kind of eagerness, a controlled eagerness, the eagerness of beings who have agreed among themselves to show nothing, and Fenrir read that too, read the quality of the assembled Aesir's attention, the specific angle of their interest, the way they were watching him look at the ribbon with a watchfulness that was different from the watchfulness of the 2 previous attempts. Then he spoke. The account in Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning gives Fenrir words, and they are careful words, not the words of an animal, not the simple response of a creature reacting to a stimulus, but the words of a mind that has worked through a problem and arrived at a position. Fenrir said that this fetter seemed to him to be of a different kind, and that though the ribbon looked slight, he did not think it would bring him honor to break so small a thing, and that he suspected the gods had made it with cunning, and that if it was as strong as they suggested, he saw no reason why he should allow it to be placed on him. The argument is precise. The honor logic is intact. A being of Fenrir's strength breaking a silk ribbon would be no demonstration of anything, would carry no weight in the accounting of power and pride that structured the world the wolf moved through. The suspicion is named without accusation. The refusal is conditional rather than absolute. What the wolf produces in the moment of Gleipnir's presentation is not rage, but reason, and it was to that reason that the gods now had no honest answer. They had known this moment was coming. The commission to the dwarves had been placed specifically because iron had failed, because conventional strength could not hold what was growing in Asgard, and because the only binding adequate to the task had to be built from a logic that bypassed strength entirely. They had sent the ribbon to Lyngvi, knowing that Gleipnir's very design would alert Fenrir to the nature of what was being attempted. They had known the wolf would see it. What they had not fully worked through or what they had worked through and arrived at a grim conclusion about, was how to answer what Fenrir would see, how to respond to the specific and legitimate suspicion of an intelligent being who had been given no reason at all to trust the gods who surrounded him on a small island in a dark lake. They offered reassurance. They said that the ribbon would be easily snapped by a creature of his power if all the stories of his strength were true, and that if he could not break it, they would release him from it. This was a lie. Not the kind of lie that is technically untrue, but spiritually in the right direction. A full, clear, deliberate lie, offered on Lingvi, because the Aesir had no truthful version of events they could use instead. The gods intended to bind Fenrir. They intended to leave him bound. The offer of release was a construction, not a promise, produced by the same calculation that had sent the messenger to Svartalfheim. Pragmatic, necessary by the logic of cosmic preservation, and completely dishonest in the specific terms it used. Fenrir heard the reassurance, and the reassurance was not enough. What came next was the demand, and it is the moment in the whole of the myth around which everything else arranges itself. The wolf said he would allow Gleipnir to be placed on him on one condition. Betif, one of the gods, must place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, as a tangible physical guarantee that the Aesir's promise was real, as a hostage to the truth of what they had said. This is the moment Galfaning pauses over, and the pause is right. The demand is not irrational. It is the only rational response available to Fenrir in that moment, the only collateral that could convert an untrustworthy promise into something with material weight, the only form of surety that had any meaning, given the distance between what the gods had said and what the wolf already understood to be true. Give me something to hold against your honesty. Give me proof that you would be injured by a lie. The gods looked at one another on the island. The account does not give the silence a length. It does not say how long the assembled Aesir stood and looked at one another across whatever distance separated them from where Fenrir waited, or how many of them held a hand behind their backs and considered the specific geometry of what was being asked. The silence is simply present in the text, the gods looking at one another, the demand hanging in the air above the island, the dark water of Lake Amsvartnir surrounding them on all sides, the ribbon lying there in someone's hand, thin and smooth, made from absence, waiting. Each god who did not step forward made a choice in that moment. The choice was coherent. The binding was necessary by the logic of prophecy and preservation and the safety of the world as the Aesir ordered it. The hand that went into the wolf's mouth would not come back, and each god who understood this and did not step forward was not being cowardly in any simple sense. They were being accurate about what they were willing to give. Then, Tyr stepped forward. Gylfaginning names him plainly. Tyr, the one-handed god of law and justice, who had been the only member of the Aesir willing to approach Fenrir daily when the wolf was still young and growing, and the other gods had already begun to keep their distance. The same figure who had made a routine of the crossing that no other god would make, walking toward Fenrir each day with food, performing that small repeated act of proximity that had, over the long time of the wolf's residence in Asgard, constituted the only sustained bond between the wolf and any member of the divine realm. It was this god who stepped forward. Now, the text does not describe his expression or his movement. It does not give him a speech or an explanation. He simply moves, crosses the space between himself and the wolf, and places his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. The right hand. This detail is specific in the sources, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because in the world the Norse tradition described, the right hand was the sword hand. the hand of treaty and oath, the hand raised in pledge, the hand that made an agreement binding between two parties who stood in front of each other and extended themselves across the space between them. The right hand was the hand of Tyr's own domain. He was the god associated with law and with the binding force of oaths, with the specific power that an agreement made correctly and solemnly carried in the structured world that Esser maintained. To place that hand in the wolf's mouth was to put the instrument of his function into the keeping of a being he was, in the same moment helping to deceive. The irony is not decorative, it is structural to the act. The god of oaths participated in a broken promise and offered the hand of his own office as the price of doing so. The binding proceeded with Tyr's right hand between Fenrir's jaws. Gleipnir was worked into place, looped around the wolf's legs, threaded and tightened, the ribbon settling against Fenrir's body, with the particular quality of something that does not resist being arranged, that holds its position without the clanking weight of chain or the cold resistance of iron, that lies against the skin with a smoothness that suggests indifference rather than grip. The dwarves had understood their commission correctly. The binding strength was not legible in its surface. It gave nothing away about its character, just lay there against the wolf, looking like what it had looked like before the attempt. A silk ribbon, a decorative thing, unremarkable in every external sense. And then Fenrir moved against it. The account in Gylfaginning is not dramatic about this moment. It does not give Fenrir's attempt a long description, does not catalog the stages of effort, or the specific sequence of movements a bound and very large wolf makes when it tests the thing holding it. What the text records is outcome. Fenrir exerted himself against Gleipnir and found that it held, more than held. The ribbon tightened with his resistance. The more force he applied, the more firmly it settled, the binding responding to his strength, not by yielding or by breaking, but by becoming, in some quiet and implacable way, more entirely what it was. This was the specific genius of what the dwarves had made. A chain resists, Gleipnir responded. A chain says, I am strong enough to oppose you. Gleipnir said, everything you do makes this more completely itself. The wolf's own power was absorbed into the binding, turned back against the binding's function, used to deepen what it could not break. The gods laughed. All of them, Gylfaginning says, except Tyr. This is one of the most specifically recorded moments in the myth. The assembled Aesir standing on Lyngvi, having watched the binding hold against the wolf's attempt, and the collective release of tension that came with knowing the problem they had been unable to solve with iron had now been solved with absence, with impossibility, with the craftwork of Svartalfheim that had arrived at strength from a direction that strength itself could not oppose. The laughter is not cruel in any simple sense. It is the laughter of beings who had known fear for a long time and were now, for the first time in a long time, on the other side of what they feared, or at least on the other side of its most immediate form. The relief in it was real. The satisfaction in it was real. Tyr did not laugh. He stood with his right hand in the wolf's mouth, on an island he would not leave with both hands, and the text does not describe what he felt, or what his expression carried, or whether he looked at the wolf, or at the other gods, or at the water surrounding them on all sides. He is simply present in the account as the one figure who did not share in the general release of the moment, a silence in the laughter, a stillness in the relief, the one member of the assembled Aesir for whom the binding success was not a simple pleasure. Fenrir understood, in the same moment, what the laughter meant. The wolf had suspected treachery on Lyngvi from the moment Gleipnir appeared. He had named the suspicion clearly, had hedged against it with the only available hedge, had taken a hostage to the god's honesty and placed it between his own teeth while he allowed the binding to proceed. And now the binding had held, and the gods were laughing, and the promise they had made that they would release him if he could not break the ribbon lay exactly where he had suspected it would lie, nowhere at all, an object that had never been created, a pledge that had been produced for the purpose of getting a hand inside his mouth and Gleipnir around his legs, and nothing more. He had known. He had made his best calculation against what he knew, and the calculation had not saved him. He bit off Tyr's right hand at the wrist. The text records this plainly. No elaboration, no description of the moment as an act of savage rage or a convulsive response to betrayal or anything that would require the narration to reach toward language it does not need. The wolf bit off the hand. Tyr lost it. The two facts are placed next to each other in the account with the same calm that Gylfaginning brings to every other documented detail about what happened on Lyngvi, the name of the island, the nature of the lake, the composition of the ribbon, the name of the sword that would later be lodged in the wolf's mouth to hold his jaws open. Events recorded with the same even attention that a craftsman brings to describing a method, not because the account is without feeling, but because the feeling is present in the facts themselves and does not need the prose to amplify it. This is the specific moral weight that the myth on Lyngvi carries, and it is weight that does not resolve, that has no clean accounting, that the tradition does not provide a frame for that would make the ledger come out balanced. Look at what each party brought to the island and what each party left with, and the accounting becomes genuinely difficult to perform. The gods needed the binding. The prophecy was clear. Odin would be devoured by Fenrir at Ragnarok. The wolf would swallow the sun. Chaos would come from this one creature's eventual freedom. The binding was not cruelty for its own sake, but a preservation of the present age, of the order the Aesir maintained, of the world in its current shape. By that logic, what happened on Lyngvi was necessary, every element of it, and Tyr had known this. He had placed his hand in the wolf's mouth, knowing the gods had no intention of honoring their promise. He had served as the collateral for a lie. He had done this deliberately, with full knowledge of what Fenrir would do when the binding held and the promise was not kept, and he had stepped forward anyway, across the space that every other god on Lyngvi had declined to cross. The hand he lost was the hand of his own domain, and he gave it in service of a deception, in service of a necessity he judged sufficient to the cost. Whether the tradition frames this as heroism depends on where the frame is placed. It was courage, plainly. The sources are clear that every other god on Lyngvi looked at one another and none moved until Tyr moved. It was sacrifice, plainly. The hand did not come back. It was also complicity in a broken promise, made by the god most directly identified with the keeping of oaths. The myth holds all of these at once and offers no resolution, no moment at which one understanding of the act overtakes the others and settles the question. Fenrir, for his part, had done nothing on Lyngvi that he had not been given a clear occasion to do. He had suspected treachery and said so. He had asked for a pledge against it. He had received the pledge, held it between his teeth while the binding proceeded, found his suspicion confirmed in the most complete possible way, and taken the forfeit that the logic of the arrangement provided. The bite was not an animal act, not a reflexive response, not instinct, but the precise fulfillment of a condition he had named out loud before he allowed any of it to begin. There was even a kind of law in it, a terrible one, narrow and mechanical, enacted at the cost of what it cost, but a law nonetheless, applied by the being who had the most reason of anyone on that island to feel that the law did not apply to him. What the tradition preserves, in holding both of these things without resolving them, is something worth sitting with in the quiet. The binding of Fenrir was necessary and honest about its necessity, and dishonest in its method. Tyr's sacrifice was courage and loss, and complicity, all in the same act. Fenrir's response was exact and proportionate, and came from a wolf chained to a rock in a dark lake, who would remain there for the rest of the current age. None of the figures on Lyngvi were simple. None of the actions taken there were clean. The island holds all of it, unresolved in the mythological record, and the record has been sitting with it for a long time without feeling any particular need to produce a verdict. The right hand was gone, and the tradition, in one of its quieter acts of preservation, did not let the loss be forgotten. Old Norse skaldic poetry, the intricate, highly compressed verse tradition in which Norse poets encoded mythological knowledge into dense and multi-layered kennings, gave Tyr's wrist a name that persisted in ordinary poetic usage long after the events on Lyngvi had passed into the deep background of the tradition. The kenning is this: the leavings of the wolf. In Old Norse poetic usage, this phrase means a sword. The reasoning is exact. What the wolf left when it took Tyr's hand was the wrist, the place from which a sword hangs, the place that defines the relationship between a warrior and his weapon, the stump that remained after the sword hand was gone. The leavings of the wolf, therefore, is what the sword replaced, the remainder after Fenrir's bite, the wrist that now ended where it ended, the wound made permanent in language. Kennings in the skaldic tradition were not casual ornaments. They were compressed references to mythological knowledge that a Norse audience was expected to carry, a kind of coded shorthand that only functioned if the listener already knew the story the kenning pointed toward. The kenning for a sword that referenced Tyr's wrist assumed that whoever heard it would know about Lyngvi, about Gleipnir, about the hand that was placed and the hand that was taken. It built the myth into the vocabulary of ordinary poetic speech, made it available not just in formal tellings, but in any context where a poet needed a word for sword, which in a warrior culture with a rich tradition of battle poetry was a context that arose with some regularity. Tyr's sacrifice was woven into the texture of the language itself. It did not require a formal occasion to be recalled. It was recalled every time a certain kind of poem used a certain kind of word for the most ordinary of warrior objects, the blade at the hip, the thing a fighter held. This is the quiet persistence of that particular loss, not preserved in stone or monument, not formally commemorated in any document that declared its importance, but kept alive in the working vocabulary of a poetic tradition, folded into speech, present in the oblique and layered way that kennings carried their content. Any Norse poet who used the phrase was in some sense performing the myth again, briefly and without ceremony, activating the story of Lyngvi for the duration of a single word before moving on to whatever the poem needed to do next. A sword is a thing. The leavings of the wolf is a sword. The wolf is the one who took the hand. The hand belonged to Tyra. The whole of it is there, compressed into the space of a short phrase, patient as calfskin, dark as old ink, waiting for anyone who knew how to read it. There is one thing more that the sources preserve from Lyngvi, and it sits alongside the kenning in the same quiet register of things that last. All binding was complete and the wolf was anchored, Gleipnir secured, the stones driven into the ground, the sword positioned in Fenrir's mouth to hold his jaws permanently open. The gods departed the island. They left Fenrir on Lyngvi in the lake. and the wolf, in the account that Snorri Sturluson records, howled. The howl was long, and the wolf was powerful, and the sound of it crossed whatever distance separated Lyngvi from the rest of the Norse world, and the account does not attempt to interpret the sound, or to explain what the wolf was expressing, or to fit it into any frame that would tell the listener what to understand by it. It is simply recorded. The wolf howled, the gods had gone, the sound went out over the water of Amsvartnir and across the mythological landscape that surrounds that dark lake, and continued for as long as it continued, and then there was silence, and Fenrir was on the island, and the world went on. What happened on Lyngvi was the careful closing of a parenthesis that had opened the moment Fenrir was brought to Asgard as a wolf pup. The gods had assessed him and decided to keep him where they could see him, and then he had grown beyond the scale of anything they had prepared for, and then they had tried to chain him with iron twice, and then they had sent to Svartalfheim for something that was not iron, and then they had brought it to a small island in a dark lake and placed it before a wolf who had looked at it and immediately understood. All of that had led to the moment of the ribbon, and the demand, and the hand, and the bite, and the kenning. The parenthesis closed. Fenrir lay on Lyngvi. The age continued, and Tyr stood with one hand and continued to be Tyr, the one-handed god, the god of law and justice, the figure whose absence of a right hand became the most physically legible marker of his identity in the mythological tradition. The loss did not retire him. It did not move him to the margins of the divine world, or reduce the weight of his domain, or make him a lesser figure in the accounting of the Aesir. What it did was make the cost visible, carry it as part of his form, keep it present in the figure of the god himself. Every representation of Tyr in the tradition afterward carries the missing hand as a fact. The god of oaths, who assisted in a broken promise, is also the god who paid for it in the most immediate and permanent of ways, and the tradition held both of these things inside the same figure without requiring them to cancel each other out. The island of Lyngvi sat in Lake Amsvartnir, in the world as the sources describe it, small, dark-shored, remote from both the halls of Asgard and the inhabited world of Midgard. The wolf lay there, the ribbon lay against him, the sword held his jaws open. Read can see here, tight we vive in Asgard. The stones anchored the binding into the ground, and from the wolf's forced open mouth, the saliva ran, continuously, in a long, thin stream, described in the mythological sources as forming a river that moved outward from the island and across the Norse landscape. Snorri names the river. Its name in Old Norse carries the meaning of hope or of expectation, the particular quality of waiting for something that has not yet arrived, the specific feeling of a being who knows that the present state of things is not permanent, who holds the knowledge of a future release as the one thread of the current moment that reaches forward into what is still to come. The river that flows from Fenrir's mouth is named for the wolf's own waiting. It leads through the world with that name, carrying it through the landscape, across whatever geography the Norse tradition placed between Lyngvi and the sea, a river named for the hope of a bound wolf, moving steadily, the way rivers move, in no particular hurry, through a world that does not know what to do with what it contains. The leavings of the wolf, a sword, a name for the thing that stands in place of the lost hand, in the vocabulary of a tradition that found in compressed and layered language the most durable container for the things it needed to keep. The kennings sat in the skaldic tradition and did what kennings do, carried its content quietly, activated it briefly each time it was used, set it down again, waited for the next poem to have need of a word for a sword. Somewhere in the language, in the way that things embedded in language persist even when no one is thinking about them directly, the story of Lingva went on. The island, the ribbon, the hand between the jaws, the bite, the wrist that remained. These are the things the sources keep, not a verdict, not a resolution, not a frame that settles which figure on the island was right and which was wrong, or whether necessity is sufficient justification for deception, or whether a broken promise retains any of the moral weight of a promise that was kept. The tradition keeps the facts and the kenning, and the howl and the river. It keeps Tyr's wrist. It keeps the specific physical arrangement of stone and silk on a small island in a dark lake. And it has been keeping these things for a very long time, in manuscripts and in verse and in the compressed vocabulary of poetic speech, patient and dark on calfskin, carrying what it carries, setting nothing down. A sword rests in Fenrir's mouth on the island of Lyngvi. Its hilt touches the ground. Its point presses upward against the roof of his mouth, holding his jaws apart, forcing them open in a permanent and fixed position that the sources describe, not as a moment, but as a condition, the state of things on the island, now and for the duration of the age. The sword was placed there after Gleipnir had been secured, after the wolf had understood what the gods intended, after everything that could happen on that small dark shore had already happened. It is an ordinary weapon performing an extraordinary function, lodged in that position while the world continues on all sides of the island, carrying on its ordinary existence without reference to the still point at Lyngvi's center. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Iceland in the 13th century, records the arrangement of the binding in Gylfaginning with the kind of precise and methodical attention he gives to physical structures, the way he describes halls and rivers, and the specific geometry of Yggdrasil's roots and branches. The account is not dramatic, it is descriptive. It treats the placement of the sword and the arrangement of the stones as things worth recording correctly, the way a builder records a method or a cartographer fixes a location, because precision serves memory, and memory serves the tradition. What Snorri describes is a structure. What that structure holds, and what it means that it holds it, is something the tradition considers with more patience than urgency. Beneath Gleipnir's thin, silken length, the arrangement Snorri describes has three components. There is the binding itself, the ribbon made in Svartalfheim, the underground realm of the dwarves, from things that do not exist, the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, things the world used in its making and then used up entirely, so that nothing of them remained when the dwarves were done. Below the binding, threaded through it, there is a large flat stone called Gjöll, and below that, driven into the ground itself, a deeper boulder called Thithy, a name that carries the sense of something struck down, fastened in place by force. 3 layers, each one named, each one part of a structure, whose purpose is not to punish or to display power, but simply to hold. The Prose Edda is clear that this arrangement was intended to be sufficient. The gods had tried iron twice before, and iron had not held. What the dwarves made from absence and impossibility held in a way that iron could not, because the logic of its construction belonged to a different order of reality than the wolf's strength. Fenrir's power was the power of a thing that had grown past the boundaries of the biological into something cosmological, his size measured eventually not in the terms of any living creature, but in the terms of the world itself, upper jaw to the sky, lower jaw to the earth, a scale that makes ordinary iron a reasonable but finally insufficient response. Gleipnir answered that power, not with greater mass or greater hardness, but with a different kind of strength entirely, one made from the structure of what cannot be broken because it no longer exists to be broken. And so the wolf lies on his side, on Lyngvi. His limbs are held by Gleipnir, threaded through Gjöll, and anchored into Thridi below. His jaws are forced open by the sword. Snorri presents this image in Gylfaginn, not as history, not as something that happened and ended, but as current fact. The binding took place. The wolf is bound. Even as the text's framing story unfolds, with the figure of Gylfag in dialogue with the disguised Aesir asking his questions about the structure of the world, Fenrir lies on Lyngvi in the present tense of that narrative, his body pressed against stone, his mouth propped open by a sword hilt resting on the ground. The world the prose Edda describes is a world in which this is presently the case. What flows from Fenrir's forced open mouth is described in the sources as saliva, continuous, unceasing, the product of jaws that cannot close, and of a body that goes on living inside its containment. The saliva moves, it does not pool at the wolf's side and dry in the island's air. It travels gathering into flow, forming a river that moves outward from Lyngvi into the wider Norse world, and that river Snorri records is called Van. Van means roughly hope. It means expectation or anticipation, the orientation of a being toward a future it believes is coming. In the Old Norse, the word carries the sense of something awaited, something looked toward, something whose arrival is both desired and considered possible. Scholars of Norse language and mythology have noted the quality of that naming for a long time. The river that flows from the mouth of a bound wolf, formed from the physical evidence of his ongoing life, bears the name of what he is believed to be waiting for, his release, the end of his constraint, the age that his captivity is keeping at a distance. The river Van moves through the Norse world as Snorri describes it, an ordinary feature of the landscape that carries within its name the memory of its origin, a river formed from containment, a river whose name encodes the nature of the thing being contained. When the Norse tradition places a geographical feature in the world, a river, a well, a mountain, a tree, it tends to do so with the understanding that the feature is meaningful, that its presence in the landscape reflects something about the structure of what exists. Van is a river with a specific source and a specific name, and the relationship between that source and that name is not incidental. It is the tradition's way of making the binding present in the world's ordinary geography, of ensuring that the fact of Fenrir's captivity and the fact of his continued hope are not abstract claims, but physical features of the world that anyone in the Norse understanding might encounter. There is something in this that the Norse tradition did not try to resolve or explain away. The gods bound Fenrir. The river that flows from his captivity is called hope. The tradition holds both of these facts with the same steadiness, without suggesting that the naming is ironic in a small or dismissive way, and without suggesting that it resolves into comfort. Hope in this context is a feature of the landscape. It moves. It cannot be stopped any more than a river can be stopped from moving toward where it is going. Odin knew about Van before Gleipnir was ever commissioned. He knew what the river would be named and what the name would mean, because the Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy preserved in the Codex Regius, the poem that describes the world's structure from its creation to its end, had already told him. The Völuspá is among the oldest and most significant poems in the Old Norse corpus. Its verses attributed to a seeress, speaking from a knowledge that encompasses all 9 realms and the full span of cosmic time. What the seeress describes in the Völuspá is not a sequence of events that might happen. It is a sequence of events that will happen, whose shape is already fixed in the structure of the world, waiting only for its time. Among the things the Völuspá describes is the release of Fenrir. The wolf bound on Lyngvi will not remain bound. The age that his captivity is preserving will end. When it ends, when the fires of Muspelheim spread outward, when the ship Nagfar made from the nails of the dead puts out to sea, when the frost giants march, when the chain Gleipnir parts, Fenrir will be free, and free, he will do what the prophecy holds. He will devour Odin, the All-Father who ordered the commission of Gleipnir, who received the seeress's account of how his own death would come, who continued governing Asgard and maintaining the structure of the present age. In full possession of that knowledge, he will be killed by the wolf, whose binding he arranged. Gylfaginning is clear on this point. Odin knows. The Norse sources do not present this foreknowledge as a detail that Odin somehow missed or refused to consider. They present it as the ground condition of everything he does in the present age. He knows the wolf on Lyngvi will one day be free. He knows what that freedom will cost him, and he maintains Asgard, sends Valkyries to the battlefields to gather the Einherjar, practices his Scyther, preserves the world's structure, not because he believes the prophecy can be undone, but because the work of the present age is worth doing, regardless of what the future holds. There is a quality to this that is distinctive within Norse cosmological thinking, and the prose Edda and poetic Edda together make it a structural feature rather than an incidental detail. The Norse gods are not ignorant of their fate. They are not deceived about it or protected from the knowledge of it. The Völuspá was recited in a tradition that understood its contents. The seeress spoke, Odin listened, the world continued, and within that continuation, the binding of Fenrir performs a function that is neither permanent prevention nor futile gesture, but something with its own precise character. What the tradition presents as defiant postponement, the phrase is worth staying with for a moment. Not prevention, because the sources are explicit that what Gleipnir achieves is temporary, a delay rather than a resolution. Not futile, because the delay is the point, the age that Gleipnir has made possible. The span of time between the binding on Lyngvi and the loosening at Ragnarok is the age in which the world takes the shape the Norse sources describe. Asgard standing, Midgard inhabited, the 9 realms in their current arrangement, the gods performing the work of cosmic order. That age exists because of what was done on Lyngvi. It has a value that is independent of its duration, and the gods know both of these things at once, the value of the present age and the certainty of its ending, and continue. The island of Lyngvi sits in the lake called Umsvartnir. Snorri names both in Gylfaginning with the same precision he brings to the binding's 3-part structure. The island is Lyngvi, the lake is Umsvartnir, and these are not decorative details, but the actual specific location of the thing he is describing. Amsvartnir's name has been interpreted as carrying the sense of deep darkness or deep water, a name that fits the character of the place as the tradition presents it. Remote, surrounded by still water, small, not easily reached from either Asgard or Midgard, the kind of place that holds what it has been given and does not easily give it back. Lyngvi itself is a name sometimes associated with heather, the low, dense plant that covers moorland, the plant that grows close to the ground across landscapes that are otherwise exposed and windswept, an island named for heather in a lake of dark water. There is nothing grand in the naming. The tradition does not give the site of one of its most consequential acts a name that announces its significance. It gives it a name that is quiet, specific, and particular, a small island in a dark lake covered in low plants, where the wolf has lain since Gleipnir was secured, and where the river Van began. From above, from whatever perspective the Norse imagination extended to, when it looked down at the 9 realms spread across the structure of Yggdrasil, Lyngvi would be difficult to distinguish from the surface of Amsvartnir, a small dark shape in dark water. Not a mountain, not a hall, not a landmark that draws the eye from a distance, a place that holds what it holds without marking itself. The wolf on the island would not be visible from the shore. The sword in his mouth would catch no particular light. The river Van, moving outward from the island's edge, would join the wider landscape and become ordinary water, carrying only its name as the record of what made it. The gods, after the binding, did not remain on Lyngvi. Gylfaginning does not describe them gathering there in aftermath, observing what they had accomplished or reflecting on its cost. The binding was a task, and the task was completed, and the work of Asgard continued. Odin returned to the high seat Hlidskjalf, from which he could see across all 9 realms, watching the structure of the world from above, receiving the ravens Hugin and Munin when they returned from their daily circuit of the world with what they had observed. The hall, Valhalla, continued to fill with the Einherjar, the warriors chosen from the battlefield dead, gathered and trained for the final conflict the prophecy had already described. The structure of the present age went on performing itself. The Norse tradition, as preserved in both the prose and poetic Edda, understands cosmic order as something that requires continuous effort to maintain. The gods are not a ruling class sitting in comfortable permanence above a stable world. They are beings who hold the structure of things in place against the forces, the frost giants, the fire of Muspelheim, the chaos that predates the world's making, that press against its boundaries from all sides. Odin's ravens circling the world every day, his wolves Gary and Friki at his feet, the warriors of Valhalla preparing. These are not the decorative details of a settled paradise. They are the working parts of a system that has to keep working in order for the present age to remain the present age. Within that understanding, Lyngvi is part of the structure. The island, the lake, the binding of stone and silk, and the sword in the wolf's mouth, these are not separate from the operation of the world. They are among the things the gods are doing to maintain it. The wolf's captivity and the world's current shape are the same fact described from 2 different angles. While Gleipnir holds, the 9 realms hold their arrangement. While the sword rests in the wolf's mouth, Asgard stands. The river Van moves through the landscape as a feature of the world that is currently the case, and its name tells anyone who follows it, to its source, what the structure of the present age is built on, a hope that is contained, a release that is coming but has not yet come, a wolf that is waiting. What the tradition asks the world to do with this knowledge, what the ordinary Norse understanding of these facts meant for the way people lived and thought and told stories, is not a question the mythological sources answer directly. The Voluspa does not pause after describing the binding to offer a moral or a consolation. Gylfaginning presents the facts of the arrangement and moves forward. The kenning, the leavings of the wolf, the skaldic phrase for a sword, the phrase that refers to what remained of Tyr after the binding was complete, encodes the events of Lyngvi into the ordinary vocabulary of Norse poetry, making them present in the language without requiring any particular response to them. They are simply there in the words, the way the river Van is simply there in the landscape. Old Norse skaldic poetry is a tradition of extraordinary density and compression, its meaning distributed across layers of reference and allusion, its language built to hold multiple significances at once. A kenning is not a decoration or a simple synonym. It is a way of naming something that carries within the name the full weight of the story behind it. To call a sword the leavings of the wolf is to call up Lyngvi every time a sword is mentioned. The island, the binding, the hand given as pledge and lost, the wolf straining against something he could not break. The sword in a warrior's hand is also, in that naming, the wrist of Tyr, what the wolf left when he understood what had been done to him. Every sword in every Norse poem that uses the kenning carries Lyngvi inside it, quietly, the way the river Van carries its source inside its name. These are not coincidences of language. They are the tradition preserving its own weight. The Norse mythological world is densely interconnected in this way, its rivers named for what formed them, its kennings built from the events they encode, its geographical features carrying the history of how they came to exist. The world of the prose and poetic Edda is a world in which everything is in some sense a record of what made it, and what made it tells you something true about the structure of what exists. A river called Hope flows from an island in a dark lake. The word for sword refers to a wound. The present age is the age Glitnir made. Snorri Sturluson set all of this down in Iceland in the early 13th century, drawing on a tradition of oral poetry and mythological knowledge that was already centuries old by the time he wrote, already part of a world that had officially converted to Christianity 200 years before, and that was in the process of slowly forgetting the shape of the older cosmology. His prose Edda is, among other things, a work of preservation, an attempt to record the kennings, the mythological figures, and the cosmological structure that Norse poetry required in order to be understood before the knowledge needed to read that poetry was gone. The Gelfegunning section, from which most of the specific details of Fenrir's story come, frames its account as a dialogue between the figure of Gulfi and three disguised Aesir, High, Just as High, and Third, who answer his questions about the structure of the god's world with the information Snorri wants to preserve. The result is that the binding of Fenrir, the river Van, the sword in the wolf's mouth, the stones Gjorl and Fuidi, and the island of Lyngvi, all of this comes to the present day through a specific act of preservation performed by a specific person in a specific time and place, for reasons that were themselves partly scholarly and partly elegiac. Snorri knew he was writing down what might otherwise be lost. The Codex Regius, the manuscript that preserves the poetic Edda, including the Völuspá, was copied onto calfskin in Iceland at roughly the same period, its verses set down in close, careful letters by a scribe who was also, in some sense, making a record against forgetting. The wolf on Lyngvi has persisted into the present because people in Iceland in the 13th century believed the stories were worth the effort of keeping. And what they kept, and what has arrived from that keeping, is a wolf still lying on an island in a dark lake, jaws forced open, the river Von still moving from his mouth, the sword still in place, the world still holding its shape around him. The Norse sources do not describe the binding as having ended. They describe it as the present condition of things, pending the age whose approach the prophecy has already announced. In the cosmological time of the prose and poetic Edda, Ragnarok has not yet happened. The wolf is still bound. Gleipnir still holds. And the world that the Norse tradition describes, 9 realms arranged across the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, Asgard aloft, Midgard below, the dead in Niflheim, and the giants in Jotunheim, and the dwarves in Svartalfheim, working at their forges underground. That world is still, from within the tradition's own temporal frame, the current world. This is one of the qualities of mythological time that makes it different from historical time. In historical time, the binding of Fenrir happened at a specific moment and then was over, a past event whose effects persisted but whose moment was gone. In the mythological time of the Norse tradition, the binding is not past, it is the condition of the present. Fenrir lies on Lyngvi now, in the present tense of every telling of the story. In the present tense of the Gelfigenning's dialogue and the Völuspá's vision, the river Van flows now, the sword rests in the wolf's open mouth now, and the future, the prophecy describes, when these things will change, when the chain will part and the wolf will be free, is a future that has not yet arrived, even in the tradition's own account of time. There is something quietly large in that framing, and the Norse tradition seems to have understood it as such, to have found in the image of the bound wolf not primarily a source of fear or dread, but a source of the particular kind of knowledge that comes from looking honestly at the shape of the world. The wolf is bound, and the binding will not hold forever, and the work of the present age is worth doing, regardless of what the prophecy holds. These three facts together describe something about the Norse understanding of existence that is not easily summarized, and that the tradition chose not to summarize, chose instead to preserve as images, as kennings, as a river with a name, as an island in a dark lake, as a sword resting hilt down on the ground with its point pressed upward. The sword will be there tomorrow on the island of Lyngvi in the lake of dark water. Its hilt will rest on the ground, its point will press upward. The arrangement of stone and silk will remain as Snorri described it, Gleipnir threaded through Gjöll and anchored into Thviti below, the wolf pressed against stone, his limbs held, his jaws open. The river Van will move from the island's edge into the world, crossing the distance between Lyngvi and everywhere else, flowing quietly through the Norse landscape with its name intact, carrying the word for hope through the geography of a world that the tradition holds to be still, for now, in the shape the gods have made it. And Odin will be in the high seat, Lithskjalf, looking out across the 9 realms. Hugin and Munin will be out in the world, making their circuit, observing what there is to observe, returning before evening with what they have seen. The Einherjar in Valhalla will be doing what they do in the present tense of the tradition, which is preparing. The halls of Asgard will be the halls of Asgard, their walls unchanged, their fires burning in the particular darkness of the Norse divine realm, which the sources describe as a place of genuine grandeur, bridges of burning colors spanning the distance between realms, the well of fate at the base of the world tree, where the Norns weave what is and what was and what will be. The world tree stands through all of this, as it has stood since before the gods made the world from the body of Ymir, as it will stand until the fires of Muspelheim consume it, its roots reaching into 3 wells, its branches holding the eagle and the hawk and the squirrel, Ratatoskr who carries insults between the eagle and the branches, and the dragon Nidhogg gnawing at the roots far below. Even that gnawing, the tradition records, is part of the structure of things, not an emergency but a feature, the world consuming itself slowly at one end while maintaining itself at the other, the 2 activities balanced across the span of the tree. This is the world that contains Lyngvi. This is the world within which the river Van is a river among other rivers, named and specific and moving. The island is small in that world, dark-shored, covered in low plants, surrounded by the still surface of Amsvartnir, and on it the wolf lies in the arrangement the sources describe, and from it the river moves outward, and the name the river carries travels with the water through the landscape, and the landscape holds that name alongside all the other names it holds, the names of rivers and mountains and wells and trees and the creatures that live in them, all of them encoding, in the Norse understanding, some piece of the structure of what is. The Prose Edda records that at the end of the present age, when the sequence the Voluspa describes has run its course, the world will be remade. After the fires, after the waters, after everything the present age contains has gone through what it must go through, the earth will rise again from the sea. New fields will grow. The surviving gods, those who do not fall in the final conflict, will meet in the grass and speak about what they remember. The world the gods made will be gone, but the shape of existence will remain, beginning again from the particular kind of beginning that comes after an ending. The Norse tradition does not treat Ragnarok as simply destruction. It treats it as transformation, catastrophic, total, and necessary, the world's way of clearing the space for what comes next. But that is the tradition's account of what has not yet happened. What has happened, in the present tense of the sources, is Lingvi, the wolf bound, the sword placed, the river beginning, and the world, on all sides of that still and specific island, continuing in the shape it currently holds, the shape that Gleipnir made possible, the shape the gods have maintained through the work of the present age, the shape that carries within it both the fact of the binding and the knowledge of its eventual end. The river Van moves across that world now, through whatever geography the Norse tradition maps on, to the space between Amsvartnir and the wider world. It moves, water that began as the physical evidence of a living thing's captivity, given a name that means anticipation, carrying that name through the landscape without urgency, the way rivers carry everything that falls into them. The surface of the van catches whatever light there is. It passes through the terrain. It passes through stone and soil and the edges of other bodies of water, the gradual slopes of the Norse landscape that Snorri and the poets before him described and named and inhabited in imagination. It moves at the pace of water, neither hurrying nor held back, finding the lowest ground and following it. The word van, hope, expectation, the orientation toward a future, travels with the river. It has been traveling since the binding, through the years of the tradition's oral transmission, through the calfskin pages of the Gylfaginning, through every telling of the myth in which the river is named and its origin explained. It is one of the small, specific, almost unremarkable details that the tradition preserved with the same care it gave to the names of gods and the dimensions of cosmic structures, the name of a river, the origin of that river, and what the name means given the origin. Three facts linked together, preserved together, still linked. What remains, when the narration has followed the binding to its conclusion and the river to its movement through the world, is something quieter than a story and larger than an argument. It is simply the image the Norse tradition left, a wolf on an island in a dark lake, the world continuing around him, a river flowing from the island with a name that means hope, carrying that name outward through the landscape in the present tense of the tradition's own account of time. The sword in the wolf's mouth, the hilt on the ground, the point pressing upward, holding, still holding, the island dark-shored and small in the still water of Amsvartnir, the world going on. The tradition that preserved all of this, the seeress who spoke the Voluspa, the poets who passed it through centuries of oral transmission, the scribes who set it down on calfskin in Iceland when the oral tradition was aging, they are long gone from the world in any historical sense. But the river Van is still moving, in the present tense of the Gylfaginning, in the slow, dark, patient waters of a myth that has survived its makers, and their makers, and everyone who carried it forward into the present. The wolf still waits on Lingvi. The sword still holds his jaws apart.